course, in life, we think that there's this wonderful line from A to B that wouldn't it be wonderful if, wouldn't it be easier if, it's kind of that life as we expect it. We expect life is going to be good, and even if we know better, we still wish that it would just be this nice line, what I call the prose line. The literal translation for prose is to get in the most efficient and effective manner from one place to another. And we realize that life isn't a prose line, and life is poetry. Life has events that shape us, that color us, that give us our depth and our character. Joseph Campbell speaks about the hero's journey, and this is the model, in that in our lives things happen. A challenge, an unexpected challenge, something we typically would not have chosen for ourselves, occurs in our lives, and many of these occur, of course, over and over again. We have our challenges. Could be the loss of a job, loss of a loved one to illness or death, ending of a relationship, or a loss of self, a loss of our own connection to self, a whole variety of things. And we have a challenge. And oftentimes it's a challenge we've not dealt with before, and it seems pretty insurmountable, and we can find ourselves in the pit of despair, that place where we don't see the way out, where the darkness is very dark, where we don't feel there's solid ground, where we don't have any old familiar handholds, any old familiar ways of being. We don't know how to deal with this, and therefore we often think that we can't, simply because we haven't dealt with this type of depth of despair in the past. But the gifts here are that only through that despair, only through that type of challenge, that type of perspective, only through the lens of despair, and only through the darkness. In fact, David Whyte, the wonderful poet David Whyte, says, in the darkness you will find horizons that you could not have found in the light. Something to that degree. But in the dark, our horizons actually expand, because what we find is, of course, we will come out of this. And when we do, we will find that we have found some gifts. And one of those gifts are our allies. Who are those that stuck with us? How did they stick with us? In what ways did they support us? Our relationships will be stronger through this difficulty. They will be stronger with those who were willing to see us through that and love us through our pit of despair no matter what. Those are our true allies, and those relationships will be stronger, and that's a gift. We'll also find our faith in a way that we can never find it on that prose line, that blue line there of going through life if everything was just fine. You don't find your faith there to the degree, to the depth that we find it through our difficulties and our desperation. And when we come out the other side, we realize we have now a new and profound connection to that which we believe in, that found us through. And we find our power. We find that place where we're standing on solid ground again, remembering that at one point we thought there was no way we could. And yet we did. And so we find our power, and we find our strength, and we evolve and we grow into our power through our faith and with the support of our allies. And that leads us to a place as well of compassion. Compassion for others when they're going through that pit of despair and that difficulty, as well as our own self-compassion of recognizing that we could love ourselves even when we were lost, even when we were in the dark, even when we were uncertain and ungainly and doubtful and clumsy. But the most important part, perhaps, is the return home. The return home to our communities, our families, with our newfound sense of allies and faith and power and compassion and all the other gifts that come through the difficulties. But just to continue on that line forward without returning back home, without that sense of sharing what we know and what we've learned with others, is a loss. To be of service is really where we need to bring ourselves for these things that we find to deepen within ourselves. The return home, and I would also argue perhaps the return home back to us before the challenge, to heal those parts of us we can actually heal in reverse and go back and heal childhood wounds and difficulties in our life from earlier with the newfound faith and power and compassion that we have now. So to return home to yourself as well is equally important. So that's the hero's journey. That's the model from Joseph Campbell. And I'll tell you, it's made a difference in my life, and maybe it'll make a difference in yours.